My name is Natalie Whitaker. I'm 42 years old, a mother, a widow, and apparently the last to know. If this is your first time here, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this story, because somewhere out there, someone might need to hear it. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's someone you love. I never meant to find anything. I just wanted to sell the car. Mark's old Camry had been sitting at the edge of our Eastmoreland driveway like a monument to silence, collecting moss and guilt. We were 3 months behind on the payments, the bank had called again this morning, and I was done pretending it would fix itself. The sky over Portland was the usual watercolor gray, soft and wet, with the kind of drizzle that doesn't fall. It lingers. Sophie had gone to school without saying much, just a rushed, "I'll be late," and a door that closed without looking back. 17 is hard. Grieving at 17? That's something else entirely. I stood in front of the car and whispered, "It's just a car." But my fingers hesitated at the handle like they were reaching for more than metal. It had been 32 days since Mark died, 32 days since the ICU nurse said aneurysm, no response time, and I stopped breathing normally. 32 days of Sophie speaking to me only in clipped utilitarian phrases, homework, groceries, don't forget to sign my field trip form. I got in. The driver's seat still held the faint scent of him, cedarwood cologne, worn leather, and something warmer I couldn't name. Not grief, not exactly. Memory, maybe. My hand hovered over the glove box. There was no real reason to open it, but something in me did. A nudge from somewhere soft but persistent. The click of the latch felt louder than it should have in the stillness. Insurance papers, an old pack of gum, sunglasses I'd seen him wear the summer we went to Cannon Beach. God, he looked alive in that photo Sophie took of us there. And then I saw it. A black USB drive wedged deep in the corner. No casing, no branding, just a tiny label with a single letter. N. I stared at it, letting it sit in my palm like it might speak first. I knew Mark's handwriting. This wasn't it. His was neat, borderline obsessive. This was messy, rushed, as if someone scrawled it while looking over their shoulder. Suddenly, I wasn't just a widow clearing out a car. I was a woman holding a thread, and somewhere along that thread something was waiting to unravel. I didn't plug it in, not yet. I just sat there in the driver's seat, rain misting the windshield, the USB heavy in my hand like it had weight beyond plastic and data. Some part of me knew. Maybe I always had. Not the details, but the shadow of something unspoken. I slipped the drive into my jacket pocket and exhaled, finally. Back in the house, the photo on the windowsill caught my eye. The three of us, Mark, Sophie, and me, last summer. He had his arms around us like nothing could break through. That picture used to comfort me. Now it looked like a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. But I had already pulled the thread, and it was too late to let go. Back home, I didn't go straight for the laptop. The USB sat on the kitchen counter like it was radiating heat. I made tea I wouldn't drink, stirred it with the same spoon Mark used to complain about, said the metal-on-ceramic clinking drove him crazy. Now it echoed through the house like a ghost of something ordinary we used to argue about. I told myself I wouldn't look. Not tonight, not with Sophie due home in an hour. But the longer I waited, the louder that tiny drive seemed to whisper, "There's more." I carried it upstairs to what I still called the guest room, though everyone else knew it as Mark's study. It smelled like cedar and old books. His law degree still hung on the wall, and beside it, a photo of him at a refugee legal aid summit, his blazer slightly wrinkled, his smile just a little too proud. He always told me he was doing good work, but when I asked for details, he'd shrug it off. "It's complicated," he'd say, and then kiss the top of my head like punctuation. I powered on his old laptop. The screen glowed, flickering slightly. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could still shut it down, pretend I never found it, but I didn't. The USB slid into the port with a click that made my heart jump. A folder appeared. No name, just that plain yellow icon. I double-clicked. Dozens of files, PDFs, Word docs, images, some labeled with strings of numbers, others with dates going back years. I opened the first document. "Mark, thank you again for helping us. I truly don't know what we would have done without you." Daniela. I didn't recognize the name. It felt foreign to my life, like something that belonged to someone else's story. I opened another. Noah's fever hasn't broken for 2 days. I promised I wouldn't ask again, but if there's anything you can do to help with the clinic, he misses you. Keeps asking about the kites. About last time. Kites? What kites? I scrolled faster now. Images next. A woman with tired eyes, dark hair pulled into a bun. She looked maybe mid-30s. In some pictures, she was alone. In others, she stood beside a boy, light brown hair, a crooked grin. And then, in one photo, there he was. Mark, laughing, holding the boy by the waist, swinging him mid-air. The smile on his face wasn't forced or polite. It was real, the kind of joy I hadn't seen in a long time. My breath caught. In another image, Mark crouched beside the boy, tying a kite string. The kid beamed at him like he hung the moon. I backed away from the desk, bumping into the bookshelf. My knees nearly gave. I grabbed the armrest of the chair and lowered myself slowly. Who was she? Who was this child? And who had Mark been to them? My throat burned. I wanted to scream, but the only sound that escaped was a broken whisper. God, Mark, what did you do? Just then, the front door slammed. Sophie. Her footsteps were fast, angry. I didn't have time to close the screen before she was in the doorway. Hoodie pulled tight around her face, pajama shorts from last night still on. Her eyes were red. Had she been crying? What is that? She asked, voice tight. I stood, trying to block the monitor. Sophie? You're spying on Dad? She snapped. Are you seriously going through his files? He's dead, Mom. Can't you let him rest? It's not what you think. No? Her voice cracked. Because it really looks like you're digging through his life like you're trying to prove something. I didn't go looking for it, I said softly. It was in the glove box. I found it. Sophie looked past me, her gaze locked on the screen, on the photo still glowing. She saw them, all of them. You kept reading, she said. I nodded. I did. The silence between us was sharp. I hate this, she whispered. I hate that he's not here to explain. I hate that we don't know who he really was. And I hate you for showing me this. The words landed like knives, but I didn't flinch. She turned on her heel. I'm going to Grandma's. Sophie, wait. But she was gone. The door slammed, and I was left alone in that quiet room, blinking at the screen, staring into a version of Mark I had never known. One who smiled in someone else's photographs. One who had made another child laugh like ours used to. And still, despite everything, God help me, I missed him. It rained again the next morning. Not the soft drizzle Portland is known for, but a steady, insistent downpour, like the sky had finally decided it was tired of holding back. Sophie hadn't come home last night. I didn't sleep. I sat at the edge of our couch with the TV on mute, the USB still in my hand, the living room dim except for the occasional flicker from the screen. My phone buzzed at 11:42 p.m., a single text from my mother-in-law. She's here, safe. I'll keep her as long as she needs. As long as she needs. That line haunted me, because I didn't know how long that might be anymore. By mid-afternoon, the rain slowed, but the weight in the air didn't. I was folding laundry in the kitchen, still in the same sweater from yesterday, when the front door creaked open. I didn't move. I heard sneakers hit the floor, heavy and deliberate. Then Sophie's voice cut through the quiet, low, controlled, too calm. You could have told me. I looked up. She stood just inside the doorway, soaked from the walk, hair clinging to her cheeks, her hands clenched at her sides like she'd rehearsed this confrontation. You could have told me you found something. I didn't mean for you to see it like that. Yeah, she said, stepping forward. Then how was I supposed to see it, Mom? You sitting in Dad's study, going through letters like he was some criminal? My throat tightened. I wasn't trying to accuse him. I was, what? Looking for proof? She snapped. That he wasn't the man we thought he was? That you were right all along to be disappointed in him? Sophie, no. She shook her head hard. You hated how close I was to him. Admit it. You never got us. You always acted like he and I were this club you weren't invited to. That's not true, I said, softer. I was proud of your bond. Her voice cracked. Then why are you tearing it apart now? I took a step toward her. She took 2 back. Because, I said, breathing through the storm in my chest, he left us with questions, Sophie. I didn't go looking for them, but once I found them, I couldn't unsee what I saw. You chose to keep reading. I nodded. I did. And now I have to live with it too, she asked. I have to carry this version of Dad you handed me? She was crying now. Not the loud kind. The shaking kind. The kind you hold in so long it tastes like iron in your throat. I hate this, she whispered. I hate that he's not here to explain. I hate that I don't know who he really was. And I hate you for showing me. The words hit harder than I thought they would. I didn't respond. I just stood there, chest burning, lips pressed tight. I'm going back to Grandma's, she said. Sophie, please, I need space. And just like that, she turned, walked to the stairs, came back down 5 minutes later with her duffel bag already packed. She didn't slam the door this time. She didn't look back. The rain had started again by the time I sat down at the kitchen table, her empty tea mug still by the sink. I stared at the window for a long time. The trees out back had started to turn, red and gold clinging stubbornly to the branches like they didn't want to let go. I understood that feeling. I didn't sleep that night either. After Sophie left again, quiet this time, no slammed doors, I found myself back in Mark's study, the USB still plugged in, the screen humming in the dark like it was breathing with me. The documents inside weren't just scraps. They had order, timestamps, patterns. The name Noah appeared in almost every message Daniela had written, first as a baby, then a toddler, then as a kid who liked to ask about clouds and kites and why the moon followed him home. I wasn't looking for numbers, but that's where the answers started to appear. Our bank account had always felt like a blur, bills, groceries, insurance. But when I opened the statements this time, I looked differently. Transfers, 2 each month, on the 1st and the 15th. Not huge, just enough to stay unnoticed. But over time, thousands. Each one went to an account labeled only with initials. DR. No last name, no obvious connection. But I didn't need more. Daniela Ruiz. I sat back, rubbing my temples, heart thudding harder than it should have. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was suspended. Like the moment just before thunder. I clicked on a PDF titled Lease AGR 2019. It was a scanned rental agreement. A modest 2-bedroom unit in Lentz, southeast Portland, signed 3 years ago. The signature at the bottom, scribbled in anxious loops. Daniela R. That address burned into my brain like it had weight. 1016 Renwick Street, Unit 2B. I knew Lentz. Not well, but enough. Sophie and I had once gone to an art exhibit near Maine, Scott Park, on a weekend when Mark said he had court prep. He'd insisted we take the long way home. Avoid I-205 traffic, he said. Now I wondered if he was avoiding something else. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Out for errands. We'll be back soon. Wasn't sure why I wrote it. Maybe I needed someone to know in case I never came back the same. My old Subaru groaned as I pulled away from the curb. The sky was low and heavy again, that early October kind of gray that makes the whole city feel like it's waiting for something. The drive to Lentz took just under 40 minutes. I passed places that looked tired, taquerias with faded signs, corner laundromats with fogged-up windows, bus stops where no one smiled. And then I saw it. The building. 2 stories. Faded blue trim, peeling paint on the balcony rails, a rusted bike rack out front with one lonely scooter chained to it. But the garden, lavender, sage, rosemary. Someone had cared enough to plant, to maintain, to hope. I parked across the street and stayed in the car. I didn't know what I expected. A confrontation? A confession? A screaming match on the sidewalk with some woman I'd never met? But what I saw wasn't any of that. The front door opened, and Daniela stepped out. Her dark hair was pulled into a braid. She wore jeans, a green cardigan, and no makeup. Grocery bags dangled from her arms. Behind her, a boy bounded down the stairs. Noah. I knew it was him even before I could make out his features. The bounce in his step, the shape of his smile, the way his nose turned just slightly up at the end, like Mark's. He said something too fast for her to catch, and she laughed. She laughed. A laugh I hadn't heard in my house in months. They walked down the sidewalk side by side. She nudged him forward when he slowed, and he skipped a few steps, backpack bouncing. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, not out of jealousy, not rage, just to keep from falling apart. They disappeared around the corner. I didn't follow. I didn't knock. I didn't scream across the street. I just sat there, breath shallow, the engine ticking beneath me. And for the first time since Mark died, I felt something collapse inside me. Not loudly, not violently, just the quiet undoing of everything I thought I understood. There's a strange stillness that settles over you when you're not sure if you're trespassing on someone else's life or mourning your own. I stayed parked for a long time. The engine had gone quiet. The heater whispered against the windshield, fogging it slightly. My fingers, still wrapped around the steering wheel, had gone stiff. I wasn't hiding, but I wasn't ready to be seen either. I saw them before I was ready. Daniela stepped out first, keys in hand, shoulders hunched slightly from the weight of the grocery bags. She didn't look like a woman guarding a secret. She looked tired, real. A few seconds later, Noah burst out behind her, one shoe untied, his backpack bouncing on his back like it had too many books for an 8-year-old. He was mid-sentence, talking fast, animated. She smiled at him, the kind of smile you can't fake, and he looked up at her like she was his whole world. Then I saw it, the curve of his chin, the slant of his brows, the way his mouth lifted more on the left side when he grinned. Mark, I didn't need a paternity test. I didn't need a confession. I saw my late husband in the way that boy moved, the way he smiled. It was like watching someone I loved through a crack in time. They walked together down the sidewalk, Daniela adjusting her grip on the bags, Noah skipping a step ahead, waving at a neighbor who called his name. I should have gotten out of the car, introduced myself, said something, anything, but my body wouldn't move. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something colder, something heavier. I wasn't sure if I wanted answers anymore, because the truth was no longer a question. It had a face, a name, a laugh, and it had nothing to do with me. Across the street, Daniela set the groceries on the curb while she unlocked the car. Noah spun in slow circles, arms out like wings. He laughed. The sound cut through me like music I used to know. I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel. Not out of anger, not jealousy. It was grief. But not just for Mark. For Sophie. For me. For the version of our life that I'd believed in so fully it never occurred to me it wasn't whole. I stayed parked until the street was empty again. Until the sky shifted from slate gray to something softer. Then I started the car, turned around, and drove home in silence. I didn't cry. Not then. But something inside me broke so quietly I almost didn't notice. Almost. When I walked through the front door, the house felt colder. Not physically, just emotionally off, like something had shifted slightly out of place. Sophie's shoes were by the stairs. Her backpack slouched against the wall like it had been tossed there hours ago. The silence wasn't comforting. It was thick, swollen. She hadn't seen me leave that morning, and I wasn't ready for her to see me now, but she was already waiting in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, hoodie pulled up even though the heat was on. Her eyes were puffy, but she wasn't crying anymore. She held the USB in one hand. "You left it in the laptop," she said flatly. I swallowed. "I didn't think you'd come in here." "I didn't want to," she said, voice tight. But it was still open. His emails, her letters, the pictures, everything. I stepped closer. "Sophie, I can explain." "No!" she snapped. "Don't!" Her voice wasn't loud, but it hit like thunder. "I already read enough. I saw them, Mom. I saw Dad with that kid, with Noah." The name caught in her throat. "And I saw her too. Daniela." She said the name like it tasted wrong. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Her hands were trembling. "You found this in his car?" I nodded slowly. I wasn't looking for it, I was just cleaning it out. I never meant to, but you kept going, she said, cutting me off. You didn't stop. No, I whispered. I didn't. Her mouth twisted. You always said you didn't understand him. But I did. I understood him. And now, I don't know what's real anymore. She turned, walked a few feet away, then pivoted back toward me. Did he ever even want us? That shattered me. Don't say that, I said quickly. Sophie, please, don't think that. Why not? She shot back. You are. I can see it all over your face. You think he chose them. No, I said, stepping toward her. I think he was torn, and he made the worst decision he could. He hid. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held them back. You hated how close I was to him. Admit it. I shook my head. I envied it. I missed that connection, but I never hated it. She didn't believe me, or maybe she just couldn't yet. She walked past me, up the stairs. The creak of each step was a countdown I couldn't stop. I followed her halfway up. Where are you going? She didn't turn around. To Grandma's. Sophie, please. I can't be here right now, she said, voice cracking for the first time. Everything feels fake. The pictures, the stories, even our house. I need space. I didn't follow her all the way up. I stood there while I heard drawers open, zippers close, clothes being stuffed into a duffel bag. 10 minutes later, she came back down. She paused at the door, not to say goodbye, just to take one last look. Her hand rested on the knob for a second longer than it needed to, and then she was gone. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house like it might never stop. I didn't chase her. I just stood in the kitchen, clutching the side of the counter, staring at the space she'd just been. And I wondered how many pieces a heart could break into before it stopped trying to hold anything at all. The house felt emptier than it ever had. It wasn't just Sophie's absence or the quiet. It was the echo of too many things left unsaid. I wandered from room to room like a woman trying to remember what normal used to feel like. Her mug still sat on the counter. Her jacket hung crooked on the banister. She'd said she needed space, but what was left for me to breathe in now? That evening, as the sky dimmed to a smoky lavender, I found myself back in Mark's study. Again, there was no plan, just a pull. A feeling that I hadn't found everything, that something still waited in the quiet corners of his life. I opened the drawer to his desk. Nothing dramatic, just the usual clutter. Paper clips, stamps, a dead pen. And then my fingers brushed against something hard tucked beneath a stack of old receipts. A small wooden box. I recognized it immediately. It was the cufflink case I gave him for our 5th anniversary. He hadn't worn cufflinks since Sophie was in preschool, but he'd kept the box anyway. I used to think that meant something. My heart kicked as I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in black felt, was a single silver key. Tiny, ordinary, but attached to it was a plastic tag. Box number 87 seen. Union First Bank, Downtown Branch. A safety deposit box? My hands trembled. My breath caught in my chest like I'd forgotten how to inhale. Why hadn't he told me? Why did it take a trail of digital breadcrumbs and a car glove box to get here? The next morning, I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I dressed quietly, pulled my coat tighter than necessary, and drove into the city with the key pressed between my fingers the entire time, like it might disappear if I let go. Union First's downtown branch sat in a granite building that always reminded me of courthouse steps, solemn, stone, built to last. The receptionist recognized Mark's name right away. Apparently, he'd been coming there for years. She gave me a quick, practiced smile, then glanced at the key in my hand. "Right this way," she said, and led me to a private room with pale lighting and a brushed steel table. She left me alone. The deposit box waited inside the wall. I slipped the key into the lock, turned it, and pulled. No dramatic creak. No music swelling. Just the hush of secrets finally making room for air. Inside was a thick brown folder, 3 unlabeled flash drives, and 1 envelope. Cream-colored, hand-addressed in his familiar slanted script. Natalie. I froze. I didn't open the folder. Not yet. I opened the envelope. And just like that, His voice returned. I unfolded the letter with hands that didn't feel like mine. It wasn't long, just one page, front and back. But as soon as my eyes caught the first line, the world around me blurred. The bank room, the quiet hum of the air vents, the distant shuffling of papers outside. It all disappeared. Natalie, if you're reading this, then something has happened. Maybe I'm gone. Maybe you've found the USB. Maybe you're already angry and heartbroken, and I deserve every bit of that. His handwriting was unmistakable. Slanted, precise, slightly rushed at the corners. It made my throat close. I've been keeping something from you for a long time, not out of malice, but fear. Cowardice, really. Years ago, during a legal aid trip in East Portland, I met a woman named Daniela. She came in scared, undocumented, with a baby in her arms and nowhere to go. She was desperate. And I was lonely in a way I didn't even recognize until I heard myself offer to stay after hours. I paused, pressing the edge of the letter against my lips. I could almost hear his voice, low, steady, apologetic. It was one night, just one, but it changed everything. I thought I could move on. I told myself it meant nothing, but a few months later she came back, with Noah. I didn't tell you. I couldn't. I was terrified of losing you, of destroying the family we built, of breaking Sophie's world. So I kept quiet, and then I kept going. The room tilted slightly. I sat down on the cold metal chair and gripped the paper tighter. When Noah got sick 3 years ago, Daniela reached out. She wasn't asking for money. She needed help keeping her son here. I used every legal channel I could to get them protection. I paid for some of the bills. I visited when I could. I watched him grow from the outside. I tried to be there for him without unraveling everything else. I failed both of you in different ways. He had, and yet I felt something loosen in my chest. Not forgiveness, but understanding. I never stopped loving you, Nat. And I never loved Daniela the way I loved you. But I did care. I still do. Because she's the mother of my son. The word son landed like a dropped glass on tile. If you found this, I know you're hurting. I wish I had the courage to tell you myself. But if I'm no longer here, there's one thing I have to ask of you, not for me. For them. I wiped at my cheek. I hadn't noticed the tears until they blurred the ink. Please look after Noah. Not like a mother, just like someone who knows his father tried. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not bravely, but tried. And protect Sophie. If my mistakes ever reach her, if they hurt her, do what I couldn't, shield her with the truth. Let her be angry. Let her heal. Everything else, the legal documents, the transfers, the contacts, they're in the folder. I'm sorry I left this mess behind. I trusted only you to carry it, even if I didn't deserve you. Always, Mark. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking so hard I had to set the letter down. I didn't cry, not in the loud, broken way I thought I would. I just sat there, surrounded by sterile walls and fluorescent light, letting the truth take up its space. He had been so many things. Devoted father, compassionate lawyer, unfaithful husband, secret keeper, and still a part of me loved him, even now. Even after all of it. I didn't call ahead. Some things, some truths, can't be said over the phone. They need to be carried. In your hand, in your voice, in your presence. So I drove back to Lentz. Same street, same apartment building with the chipped blue trim and rusting bike rack. I'd memorized the walk across the street, the smell of the garden, lavender, damp concrete, and the faint sweetness of something baking somewhere nearby. This time, I brought the envelope. Mark's letter for her. It took me 3 knocks before I heard movement inside. A pause. Then the door opened just a crack. Daniela stood there. She was in jeans and a soft navy sweater, no makeup, hair damp like she'd just stepped out of the shower. Her face was pale, cautious. "You're Natalie," she said, more statement than question. I nodded. "Yes." She looked past me, as if searching for someone else. "Is Sophie okay?" she asked, voice tightening. "She's with her grandmother." A long pause. Then, with a tentative hand, she opened the door wider. "Would you like to come in?" Her apartment was small but warm. Plants on the windowsill, a stack of school papers near the table, a crocheted blanket draped over the couch that didn't match anything, but made the space feel lived in. She poured tea without asking, cinnamon and orange peel. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, legs angled slightly away from each other. I held the envelope in my lap like it might burn if I didn't keep both hands on it. "I don't know what you've been told," she began, "but I never intended to ruin—" "I believe you," I said quietly. That stopped her. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her fingers wrapped tightly around her mug. "I didn't come here to accuse you," I continued. "I came to give you this." I slid the envelope across the table. She didn't open it. Not yet. Just placed her hand on it like she needed to feel the weight of his words before letting them in. "I loved him," she said, eyes filling. "Not the way you did. Not with a house and a child and Sunday breakfasts, but he saved us." I looked down at my hands. I could have argued. I could have said, he broke us too, but what would have been the point? "Noah doesn't know," she whispered. "Not really. He thinks his dad worked far away, that he was too busy to visit, but that he cared, always." I nodded slowly. "And now?" She looked at me, full of fear and hope. "Now I don't know what happens." I took a breath. "Neither do I." Her voice cracked. "You don't have to be here. You didn't have to come." "I know," I said, eyes stinging. "But someone had to." We sat there, two women tangled in the same man's memory. Not rivals, not enemies, just survivors of the same storm, each holding a different corner of the wreckage. For the first time since Mark died, I didn't feel hollow. I felt human. It was late afternoon when I heard the front door creak open. No knock, no text. Just the soft clatter of sneakers hitting tile, the low thud of a duffel bag dropped by the stairs. I froze in the kitchen, one hand still holding a slice of apple I'd meant to eat an hour ago. The house had been too quiet for days, its silence bloated with everything unspoken between us. Sophie stood just inside the doorway, her hair a little messy, sweatshirt sleeves pulled down over her hands. She looked older somehow, tired in a way 17 shouldn't look. She saw me but didn't say anything. I cleared my throat. "Hey." She nodded once. "I read the letter." Her voice was steady but quiet, like she'd burned through her rage and was left with just smoke. I didn't respond right away. I just set the knife down and waited. "I found it on the desk," she continued. "I didn't mean to, but I guess I kind of did." I nodded slowly. "It was meant for me. But it's okay that you read it." Sophie walked farther into the room. Not close, but closer than I'd expected. "Did you know everything before he died?" she asked. "No," I said. "Not even close." She bit her bottom lip. "It's weird. I kept thinking if I knew the whole truth it would make everything make sense. But now I know. And I just feel worse." I exhaled. "I know that feeling." Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve. "Is it true? All of it? The night with Daniela? The money? The kid?" "Yes," I said gently. "His name is Noah." She flinched slightly, like the name stung. Sophie turned toward the fridge but didn't open it. "Do you think he loved us less? Because of them?" I stepped forward, slowly. "I think he loved all of us, just imperfectly. In the most human, broken way possible." She blinked hard. "That doesn't make it better." "No," I said, "but it makes it real." She looked at me then, her eyes softer than they'd been in weeks. "I don't forgive him." "You don't have to," I whispered. "But I don't hate him anymore either," she said. That was enough. She reached into the fruit bowl, grabbed a pear, and took a bite like she hadn't eaten all day. We stood in the same space, the same room, but something had shifted, barely, subtly, like a window cracked just enough to let the air in again. She didn't hug me. I didn't reach for her. But for the first time in weeks, she stayed. It had been 2 nights since Sophie came home. She still moved through the house like a guest, quiet, careful, never lingering too long in one room. but she was here. That was something. On the third morning, I woke before the sun and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank page in front of me. The mug of tea beside me had gone cold, untouched. I wasn't sure how to begin. I'd written hundreds of letters in my life, birthday cards, thank you notes, even the ones I never sent to Mark when we fought. But this was something different. This was for a boy who didn't know I existed. And yet, somehow, I already carried a piece of him inside me. I took a breath, picked up the pen, and began. Dear Noah, you don't know me. Maybe your mother has mentioned my name. Maybe not. That's okay. I'm not writing to confuse you or to claim anything from you. I'm writing because sometimes adults make choices that leave kids holding questions they were never meant to carry. My name is Natalie. I was married to your father, Mark. I don't know what you've been told about him. Maybe you think he worked too much or lived far away or just wasn't ready to be part of your life. And none of that is your fault. The truth is, he loved you. Quietly. From a distance. In a way that was messy and scared and far from perfect. But it was love. He kept your drawings. He saved your photos. He read every message Daniela sent. And yes, he made mistakes. Big ones. Ones that hurt people. But he never once spoke of you like you were a secret. You are not a secret. You are not a mistake. You are not something to be hidden. You are a boy who loves kites and science, who laughs with his whole face, who probably asks more questions than most people have answers for. I know this, not because someone told me, but because I saw you once, from across the street. And in that moment, I saw Mark's smile on your face. It stopped me cold. I paused, tears welling. I kept going. I won't pretend this is easy. My daughter Sophie is still trying to make sense of everything. She's angry. I don't blame her. We were blindsided. But I want you to know we don't blame you. You are wanted. You are valuable. You deserve every good and beautiful thing life can offer. One day, if you ever want to talk or ask questions or just meet someone who knew your father in a different way, I'll be here. Not as a replacement for anything, just maybe as a bridge. Until then, be kind to your mom. She's stronger than most people I know. And be kind to yourself, especially on the days the world doesn't make sense. With warmth, Natalie. When I finished, I folded the letter gently, like something sacred, slipped it into an envelope, wrote his name on the front. I didn't mail it. I wasn't ready for that, but I placed it in the top drawer of my desk, next to Mark's letter to me. Maybe one day Daniela would find it. Maybe Noah would read it when he was old enough. Maybe he wouldn't need it at all. But I needed to write it. Not for closure, for clarity, for courage. It was evening when I noticed the drawer slightly open. The one in my desk where I'd tucked away Mark's letter. I'd never told Sophie it was there. But I hadn't locked it either. Maybe some part of me had wanted her to find it on her own terms, when she was ready. Now, I stood outside her bedroom door, hearing only silence. No music, no phone buzz, no footsteps, just the faintest sound of paper shifting, and the kind of stillness that says someone's holding their breath. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. Instead, I sat on the hallway floor and leaned my back against the wall. The baseboard was cold. The wood beneath me creaked, but she didn't say a word. 10 minutes passed. Maybe more. Then, the door opened. Sophie stepped out, her face unreadable. She held the letter in both hands, creased now, like she'd folded and unfolded it too many times. Her eyes were puffy, but dry. Her voice quiet, but steady. I read it, she said. I nodded, standing slowly. Okay. She didn't hand it back. He wrote like he knew, she continued, looking down at the page. Like he knew I'd find it too. Not just you. Maybe he did, I said. She looked up then, and there was something in her expression I hadn't seen in weeks. Softness. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something gentler than anger. He said he was afraid, she whispered. I think he was terrified, I replied. She shook her head slightly. He shouldn't have been. No, I said. But people are messy, especially the ones we want to believe are perfect. Silence settled between us again, but it didn't feel heavy, just full. Sophie stepped forward. I don't forgive him. I know, I said, meeting her gaze. But she hesitated, then added, I don't want to hate him either. That broke something in me, in the best way. You don't have to decide now, I said gently. She looked down at the letter again. He was still my dad. And you were still his whole world, I said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she pressed the letter to her chest, like something she needed to hold before it disappeared. Do you want to keep it? I asked. She nodded. Just for a while. Okay. She turned, walked back into her room, and this time, when the door closed, it didn't feel like a wall slamming shut. It felt like a pause. And that night, I passed her door on my way to bed. Light spilled beneath the frame, soft and warm. I didn't knock. I just kept walking, heart a little heavier, but finally, no longer hollow. Autumn arrived in quiet waves that year. Not the dramatic kind with swirling red leaves or sudden winds tearing through the trees, but the kind that crept in slowly. Mornings grew cooler. The sun took its time rising. Our maple tree in the backyard dropped its first leaf without ceremony. Inside the house, things shifted just as subtly. Sophie stayed. That in itself felt like a small miracle. She didn't slam doors anymore, didn't avoid eye contact, didn't move through rooms like a ghost. But she didn't exactly reach for me either. We existed like two lines running parallel, never quite crossing, never fully apart. Some afternoons, I'd find her curled up on the couch after school, earbuds in, laptop open. Sometimes she was watching old videos, sometimes just staring at the screen, like the answers she wanted might appear if she waited long enough. She didn't hide them when I walked in. One afternoon, I caught the flicker of a 10th birthday video, Mark holding a cake that tilted dangerously to one side, Sophie giggling behind cupped hands. He had frosting on his chin. I watched myself reach into the frame and wipe it away, while all three of us laughed. I miss him, she murmured, not looking up. I sat beside her, leaving enough space between us to not crowd the moment. I do too. She leaned her head gently against my shoulder. It was the first time she'd touched me without hesitation since the funeral. Do you think he ever meant to fix it? She asked. I took a moment, let the question breathe. I think he wanted to, I said. But I don't think he knew how. She didn't respond right away, but she didn't pull away either. That night, I baked apple bread. The house smelled like cinnamon and sugar, and something that felt dangerously close to peace. I left a slice for her on the counter. When I came down in the morning, the plate was empty. A single sticky note sat next to it. Thanks. We didn't talk about Noah, we didn't mention Daniela, not yet, but the silence between us had softened. Not everything needed to be spoken right away. Some grief doesn't demand sound. It just needs space. The light in the living room was soft, muted gold from the setting sun spilling through the blinds, catching the dust in the air like tiny floating sparks. I was walking past, heading toward the laundry room, when I caught the faint sound of laughter. Not present-day laughter. Old laughter. I paused. Sophie was curled up on the couch, knees tucked to her chest, blanket around her shoulders. Her laptop rested on her thighs, screen tilted just enough for me to see what she was watching, and I knew the video before I even saw the faces. Her 10th birthday. The one with the zoo-themed cake and the party hats that didn't fit right. The one Mark insisted on recording himself, even though the footage was shaky and the audio too loud. On screen, Mark stood in the kitchen, wearing a ridiculous green party hat that drooped to one side. He held the cake slightly off-center, trying to balance it while blowing out the candles with Sophie beside him, grinning so hard her eyes squinted shut. You remember that? I asked softly. She didn't jump. She just nodded. He dropped the cake 5 seconds after this, she murmured, right onto the floor. I smiled, sitting at the armrest of the couch. And you laughed so hard you cried. He had frosting on his chin, she added, voice catching just slightly. You wiped it off and kissed his cheek. He pretended to be annoyed, but he loved it. We watched in silence for a while. 3 people frozen in time, a family that for a brief moment had no secrets, no fractures, Just laughter and too much sugar. Sophie didn't take her eyes off the screen. "I miss him," she whispered. "I know," I said. "Me too." She leaned slightly, just enough for her shoulder to rest against my knee. "Do you think he ever planned to tell us?" she asked. I hesitated. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because none of them felt right. "I think he tried," I said, in his own broken way. Maybe the letter was the closest he could get. She nodded slowly, then closed the laptop. "I don't know how to feel about him anymore," she admitted. "That's okay," I said. "Feel whatever you feel. All of it's real." She sat in thought for a long moment, then looked up at me with tired eyes. "He wasn't who I thought he was." "No," I said gently. "But he still loved you." That part was always real. She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. Instead, she leaned into me, head resting against my arm. We didn't talk after that. We didn't have to. In that moment, we were just two people sitting in the stillness of something tender and unfinished, and for the first time, it felt like we weren't carrying the grief alone. The message arrived just after midnight. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling through the same 3 apps like they might eventually offer answers to something I couldn't name. When the email buzzed into my inbox, the subject line made my breath catch. From Daniela. I sat up, turned on the lamp. The email was short. No introduction, no small talk. Just, "I found this in Noah's study folder. Thought you should have it. For Sophie, maybe. Take care, Daniela." Attached was a single image. I clicked. It was a photo of Noah, taken months before his accident, judging by the length of his hair. He was standing in front of a small art exhibit, arms casually crossed, that same crooked smile that always made him look like he knew a joke no one else had heard yet. Beside him was Sophie, but not 10-year-old Sophie, not toddler Sophie. This was a digital painting, hand-drawn maybe by Noah himself, of Sophie at age 16, wearing her favorite yellow hoodie, hair tied back, smiling, and below the image, in neat handwriting, "No matter what happens, she deserves to know I saw her, that I remembered her." I blinked hard, because for all the pain, for all the lies, for all the versions of him I still couldn't reconcile. There was that small, stunning truth. He had still been thinking of her, of us. The next morning, I printed the photo and placed it gently into a frame. When Sophie came down for breakfast, bleary-eyed and quiet, I slid it across the table. She stared at it for a long time. "Did he draw this?" she whispered. "I think so," I said. "Daniela found it, sent it over." Her hands hovered above the frame but didn't touch it. "Why would he keep this? If he'd already left us?" I exhaled slowly. "Because maybe he never fully did." Sophie looked up. Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. "It's weird. I'm still mad. But this helps." "That's okay," I said. "Healing's messy and slow. You don't have to decide how to feel all at once." She nodded, then quietly carried the framed photo upstairs. That day, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like a breeze that finally turns the air after a long, still summer. Maybe forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. Maybe it starts with proof that we were seen. There's something about setting the table that makes silence louder. The clink of ceramic, the rustle of napkins, the hush between breaths. It all feels like the house is holding itself still, waiting. It was our first dinner together since everything. Daniela sat across from Sophie, folding and unfolding her cloth napkin. I watched from the kitchen doorway, heart thudding like I was bracing for a storm. I hadn't even planned this. Sophie had asked if Daniela could stay, not just for lunch, not just for coffee, but dinner. "She looks nervous," Sophie had whispered. "So are you," I'd replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. And now here we were. I carried the casserole dish to the table. Chicken baked in cream and garlic, Noah's old favorite. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Smells amazing," Daniela said softly, offering a faint smile. Sophie poked at her food with her fork. "Did you cook this a lot for him?" The question wasn't accusatory, just real, just present. Daniela blinked, then nodded. Yeah, he liked it on Sundays, especially when it rained. She looked up at me. You must have made it too, huh? I met her eyes. Every Sunday for 10 years. A pause. No one moved. Then Daniela laughed. Quiet, almost apologetic. God, this is weird. We all laughed. It broke the stiffness like a window cracking open. Sophie leaned forward, elbows on the table, something I usually corrected but didn't tonight. What was he like when he wasn't with us? Daniela's expression turned gentle, tinged with something I didn't expect. Regret. He was good, but tired, always looking out the window like he was missing something. She looked at me then. I think I understand now what that something was. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Sophie whispered, he used to hum when he made toast. Always off key. Daniela smiled. He did that at our place too. We ate. Slowly. Carefully. The kind of meal where every bite carries memory. At one point, Daniela reached across the table, brushing a crumb from Sophie's chin. Sophie didn't flinch. When dinner ended and the plates were cleared, Sophie turned to me. Can she stay a bit longer? I looked at Daniela. She looked like someone still rebuilding their breath. Yeah, I said. She can stay. It was just after breakfast when I found them in the backyard, Sophie sitting cross-legged on the grass, and Daniela's little boy, Noah Jr., perched beside her with a juice box and a dandelion in hand. They looked like they belonged to the same summer. I stood at the kitchen window, my hands still damp from washing dishes, watching them like a scene I wasn't sure I was allowed to witness. He said his dad loved dandelions, Sophie told me later, when I stepped out with a tray of snacks. Said he used to blow them and make the same wish every time. What was the wish? I asked gently. Sophie glanced at the boy. That he'd stop hurting people. My breath caught. For a moment I didn't know what to say. Daniela, who had joined us silently, knelt beside her son, running her fingers through his hair. He never said that to me, she murmured, her voice cracking under the weight of truths she hadn't asked to carry. Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she offered the boy a grape from the tray. My dad once told me the same thing, that he didn't know how to stop hurting people. Said he tried, but something inside always slipped loose. Noah Jr. looked up. Was he your dad too? Sophie hesitated, then nodded slowly. Half of him, I guess. Maybe more. They sat like that for a long time. Two kids from opposite ends of the same grief. No walls between them, just grass and sunshine and quiet understanding. I sank onto the patio chair, eyes damp, heart fuller than it had been in years. Daniela turned toward me. I was terrified she'd hate him, that she'd hate me. Sophie didn't look away from the boy. I did. For a while. But I'm starting to understand. He was broken, and none of us broke him. None of us. He came that way. Daniela nodded, swallowing hard. I didn't know how to explain that to my son, that the man who kissed his forehead at night wasn't whole. You don't have to explain everything at once, I said. Sometimes kids just need the truth to be offered in pieces, like puzzle parts. They'll put it together when they're ready. The boy laughed suddenly, chasing after a butterfly that drifted too close. Sophie followed him with a soft smile. Daniela exhaled, her shoulders dropping as if she'd been carrying her whole life between them. That afternoon, the sun didn't feel like it was shining through grief. It just felt warm. It started with cautious steps. Sunday afternoons, just an hour or two. Noah would walk up the porch with his hands shoved in his hoodie pockets, his eyes shifting between the welcome mat and the doorframe. Sophie trailing behind, always a little more guarded. I remember the first visit clearly, how I opened the door and smiled like it was any other Sunday, like we weren't strangers trying to patch over years of silence and unspoken grief. Hey, Mom, Noah said, voice unsure. Hey, sweetheart, I replied, trying not to flinch at how foreign it felt. Inside, the air was thick. I had set out his favorite snacks, arranged the living room just like he used to like it. Too carefully, I know now. It felt staged. He sat, stiff, on the edge of the couch. Sophie perched on the armrest, arms crossed. "How's school?" I asked. "Fine," Noah muttered. Sophie said nothing. I offered tea, cookies, stories from the neighborhood. But it was like tossing stones into a well. No echo, just still water. Then, one weekend, things shifted. Noah noticed a photo on the shelf, an old one of him and Mark building that birdhouse. Noah, maybe 7, covered in sawdust, beaming. "You kept this," he said softly. I nodded. Of course. That was one of the last days he laughed like that. Something cracked open in him. He smiled. Barely. But it was real. Another time, I walked in from the kitchen and found Sophie leafing through my sketchbook. My hands trembled, expecting a jab, a scoff, but instead she looked up and said, "You still draw?" "Not as often," I admitted, but I never stopped. Her gaze lingered on one unfinished sketch of her and Noah on the swing set. "You never showed us these." "You never asked," I whispered. She didn't respond, but she didn't shut the book either. Each visit after that loosened something. We cooked together, played board games. Noah once even asked for advice on a school project. It wasn't a flood, but it was a steady drip of trust returning. Then came the afternoon when Sophie showed up alone. No Noah, just her. She stood awkwardly in the doorway. I brought that lemon cake you used to make. Tried baking it. Want to judge it harshly?" I laughed, heart swelling. "You sure you want honest feedback?" She smirked. "Not really." We sat on the back porch, forks in hand, cake between us. She chewed thoughtfully, then blurted, "I was so angry, not just at you, at everything. At Dad for dying, at Noah for crying all the time, at myself for not knowing how to fix it." "I know," I said gently. "I was angry too." The silence after that wasn't heavy. It was healing. Trust doesn't return in grand gestures. It comes in mismatched mugs of tea, in letting your daughter burn a lemon cake and eat it anyway, in watching your son find his voice again, slowly, hesitantly, but steadily. Every visit was a fragile step across a broken bridge, and maybe we weren't fully across yet, but we were meeting in the middle, and that was more than I had dared hope for. The autumn sun spilled golden light through the hospital window, warming the edges of my mother's blanket. I sat beside her, tucking it gently beneath her arms. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and for the first time in years, her hand lay in mine without flinching. "You didn't have to come today," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I wanted to," I said simply. There was no performance, no martyrdom in my tone, just quiet truth. We'd spent years speaking in riddles and silences, but something about this season, about this moment, had stripped us bare. She turned her head slowly to face me. "You remind me of your father, not in the way he looked, but the way he'd just be there, quiet, unshakable." A knot formed in my chest. She hadn't spoken of him like that since the funeral. "He always showed up," I whispered, "even when you couldn't." The words hung in the air, raw and undiluted. "I know," she said after a long pause. I should have been more present. For you. For Sophie." Her confession cracked something open in both of us. I didn't nod or cry. I just held her hand tighter, grounding us in the now. She didn't apologize for the years lost. We both knew some things couldn't be rewritten. But the recognition mattered. It was a language we'd never shared before. Just then, Sophie's laughter echoed from the hallway. I looked up to see her balancing 2 lattes and a brown paper bag. "Peace offering," she grinned, dropping the bag onto the tray table. "Mom, they had your favorite cranberry muffin." "Sweetheart, you didn't have to." "I know," Sophie cut in, a softness in her voice. "But I wanted to." We exchanged a look, one of those rare, delicate understandings that didn't need explanation. Mom took the cup in her fragile hands, sipping slowly. "This is the best I've felt in a long time." I smiled, not because things were perfect, they weren't, but because the 3 of us, broken in our own ways, were sitting in the same room, sharing coffee in silence, and it was enough. Later, when Sophie stepped out to take a call, my mother turned to me. "Sophie told me everything. About Daniela. About what you found." I stiffened, but she reached for my wrist gently. "You did what you had to. I'm proud of you for facing it." I blinked, unsure how to respond. Then she added, "And I'm sorry I wasn't the one to help you through it." A breath caught in my throat. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was giving me space to breathe, to be angry and grateful all at once. We sat in silence again, this time not out of habit but comfort. Outside, leaves danced across the parking lot. Change was messy. It was late, but it had finally come. The school gym buzzed with energy, parents, teachers, students darting from one colorful display board to another, voices echoing off the high ceilings. But my eyes were locked on one table in particular, tucked in the far corner beneath a banner that read, "How Memory Lives in Glass." Noah stood beside his project, eyes bright behind his wire-rimmed glasses, explaining his experiment to a group of curious judges. His voice was calm but animated, his gestures sure and practiced, so unlike the shy boy who once used to hide behind me at drop-off. I stood quietly near the back, heart thudding. Daniela noticed me before he did. She was crouched beside the table, straightening a loose wire on the setup. When she looked up and saw me, something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, not regret, just something soft and steady. "You came," she said, walking over. "I promised I would." She nodded. "He's been talking about this for weeks." Just then, Noah caught sight of me and lit up. "Auntie Claire!" He rushed toward me, wrapping his arms around my waist. I knelt to meet him, squeezing him tightly, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, the quiet resilience in his small body, the joy he carried despite everything. "I used your idea," he whispered proudly. "The glass from that broken window, remember?" I smiled, blinking away tears. "I remember. That was the best part of the experiment." Behind him, his board was covered with diagrams, photos, even a short quote in delicate handwriting. "Some memories don't fade. They just need light to shine again." Mark's words. The principal stepped up to the mic, announcing the winners. I wasn't even listening. Noah's beaming face was all that mattered. But then his name was called. Daniela gasped beside me. Noah froze for a second, wide-eyed, before darting up to the stage with an awkward little jog. The applause was thunderous, but all I heard was my own heartbeat. After the photos, he clutched the ribbon in his hand and came running back. "You were here," he said, breathless. "Of course I was," I whispered. "And I always will be." Daniela reached over, placing a hand gently on my arm. "You're part of this," she said. "Whether you wanted to be or not, you are." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the gym, at the parents cheering, the teachers beaming, the tangled joy of it all. In a sea of paper rockets and baking soda volcanoes, our family had built something else. Memory, resilience, love. Noah tugged on my sleeve. "Can we get ice cream?" I laughed. "Only if you promise to explain how photosynthesis works while we eat." He groaned dramatically. "Deal." And just like that, something healed. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. The late autumn sun was already dipping below the rooftops when I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same. Gray shutters, red maple out front, the faint hum of the old porch light flickering on. But I could feel it in my chest. Something had shifted. Not just in me, but in her. I knocked, even though I had a key. Some part of me knew it was no longer my place to just walk in. Sophie opened the door, her face unreadable. "Hey," I said softly. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Did you forget something?" Her tone wasn't cruel, just cold, measured. "I was hoping we could talk." She didn't move. "Talk about what, Claire? About how you disappeared after everything? Or about how you came back acting like nothing happened?" I swallowed. "You're right. I should have said more. I should have stayed, but I didn't know how. And I was hurting too. She stepped aside, wordlessly allowing me in. The air inside was thick with unsaid things. The living room had changed. New couch, different rug. But on the coffee table sat the same photo of Mark holding Sophie as a baby, both of them laughing, eyes full of light. She caught me staring at it. "He used to carry that photo in his wallet," she said. When I found it again, I realized some things never leave us, even when people do. I nodded, not trusting my voice yet. Sophie folded her arms tighter, looking at me with eyes that were no longer a child's. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie," I said gently. "I withheld. I thought I was protecting you." "That's the same thing," she snapped. "You kept his illness from me. You let him die without letting me say goodbye. And now what? I'm just supposed to smile and eat Sunday dinner like everything's fine?" Her voice cracked on that last word, and it broke me. "No," I whispered. "You're not supposed to do anything. You're allowed to be angry. You're allowed to hate me if you need to. But I came here because I needed you to know I never stopped loving you, even when I got it all wrong." Sophie looked away, blinking fast. A long silence settled between us. Finally, she said, "I still don't forgive you." I nodded. "That's okay." Her eyes met mine again, this time not with rage, but something else. A wound still open, but no longer bleeding. "I'm not ready," she added. "I'll wait," I said. She turned away, picking up a mug from the table, cradling it in both hands. "You want tea?" My throat tightened. "Sure." And just like that, we stood in the kitchen together. Not healed, not whole, but present. It was a start. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind that used to slip by unnoticed. But now, every moment between Sophie and me felt precious, measured by the effort it took just to be near each other without flinching. We were sitting on the front porch, mugs of lukewarm coffee in hand. The wind played with the last golden leaves clinging to the dogwood tree. Sophie rested her elbows on the railing, gaze distant. "Do you ever feel like if you look too closely at something, it might fall apart?" she asked suddenly, voice low. I turned to her, watching the tension in her shoulders. "All the time." She let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. "That's how I feel about us, like we're held together by threads I'm afraid to tug on." My heart ached. "I know I broke your trust, and I don't expect it to come back overnight. But maybe we don't have to tug. Maybe we just learn to hold it gently." She didn't respond at first, just kept staring out at the yard where Noah's old soccer ball sat half deflated under the bushes. After a while, she asked, "Why did you come back?" I took a breath. "Because I finally realized leaving didn't protect anyone. Not you, not me. It just froze us in time. And I'm done running from the past." She looked at me then, truly looked. And in her eyes, I didn't see forgiveness. Not yet. But I saw consideration. A pause in the storm. "I don't know if I'm ready to be a family again," she whispered. "Not the way we were." "We don't have to go back," I said. "Maybe we just build something new, from here." She nodded slowly. "But you have to understand something. This time I get to choose. I get to decide what stays and what goes." "I wouldn't want it any other way," I replied. We sat in silence again. Not heavy this time. More like soil freshly turned. Still raw, but ready. She stood up and stretched. "I'm going to see Daniela later. She's helping me clear out Dad's garage." "That's good," I said, rising with her. "Let me know if you want help." She shrugged, then gave a small smile. "Maybe. Not everything's about fixing things, Claire. Sometimes it's just about showing up." I smiled back. "I'm here." And as she disappeared into the house, I stayed on the porch a moment longer, breathing in the late autumn air, letting it settle in. This wasn't resolution. It wasn't closure. But it was a beginning. One chosen, not inherited. And maybe, for once, that was enough. It was a Thursday evening when the text came through. Short, barely punctuated, almost hesitant. "Dinner this Sunday. Just us. 6 p.m.? I stared at the message, rereading it like it might vanish if I blinked too long. Sophie wasn't one to extend casual invitations, especially not after everything. My fingers hovered above the screen for a few seconds before typing back, "I'd love to. Thank you." That Sunday, I stood on her porch with a bottle of wine in one hand and my heartbeat in the other. The door opened before I could knock. Sophie stood there in jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair tucked behind one ear. No makeup, no mask. "Hey," she said, not quite smiling but not closed off either. "Hey," I replied, offering the wine. Thought this might go well with dinner. She took it, glancing at the label. "Still a red drinker, huh?" "Some things don't change." She stepped aside, letting me in. The scent of roasted garlic and thyme filled the air. The table was already set, 2 plates, mismatched but clean, with cloth napkins folded carefully beside them. I noticed the little effort, the quiet message. We sat down without much ceremony. She served roast chicken and lemon potatoes, dishes our mother used to make on rare, peaceful nights. Conversation began slowly. Updates on work, a passing mention of Daniela's new puppy, Noah's science project. But halfway through the meal, she put her fork down and looked straight at me. "You know," she said, voice steady, "for a long time, I didn't think I could ever share a table with you again." I met her gaze. "I wouldn't have blamed you. But here we are," she continued. "Not because everything's forgiven, but because I needed to see if it could feel different now." "And does it?" I asked quietly. She paused, then shrugged. "A little." A beat of silence passed. I reached for my glass. "I'll take a little. It's more than I deserve." She let out a soft laugh, real if brief. "You always had a flair for dramatic humility." I smiled. "It's part of my charm." She rolled her eyes but didn't look away. "Claire, I don't know what this is yet." Us. But I'm not angry all the time anymore. And that's new. "I'm not here to rewrite the past," I said, my voice thick with honesty. "Just hoping maybe we can draw something better from it." She nodded slowly. "Me too." When I got up to leave later, she walked me to the door. Just before I stepped out, she said, almost as an afterthought, "Next Sunday too?" I turned, surprised. "You sure?" She shrugged. "We'll see." And just like that, a door that had long been closed didn't swing open, but it didn't lock behind me either. It stayed ajar, just enough for warmth to pass through. It was a chilly afternoon in late November when I heard a soft knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone, certainly not him. I opened it slowly, and there he was. Noah. His hair had grown longer, brushed back awkwardly like he wasn't quite used to styling it himself. He stood there in an oversized hoodie and jeans, holding a small backpack in one hand and a nervous half-smile on his face. "Hi," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered, but still unmistakably his. I blinked. "Noah, what are you doing here?" He shuffled on the porch. I was at Dad's for a while, but he's in Texas now with Karen, and it's..." He looked down, then back at me. "It's not really home." I stepped aside without a word. He came in slowly, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to anymore. The living room was warm, a quiet jazz record playing low. On the table was a science magazine he used to read with Mark. I caught him glancing at it. "I didn't throw anything out," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just moved some things." Noah dropped his bag by the couch and sat down, his shoulders tense. After a long pause, he asked, "Do you hate me?" The question hit harder than I expected. I sat across from him, searching for the right words. "No," I said quietly. "I never hated you. I was hurt, confused, but never hate." He nodded slowly. "I read your letter. A few times. I didn't know what to say back." "You don't have to say everything now," I replied. "Just being here says a lot." He looked at me then, eyes misty but steady. "I miss him, Mark. I miss how we all used to be." I reached out, resting my hand over his. "Me too." We sat like that for a while, the silence not empty but full. full of unspoken memories, apologies, grief, and the fragile hope of something new. Later that evening, I made his favorite, mac and cheese with crushed garlic chips on top, just like Mark used to make. He laughed when he saw it. "You remembered?" "Of course I did." He ate like he hadn't had a home-cooked meal in weeks. Maybe he hadn't. And as we cleared the dishes together, something soft settled between us. Not resolution, not yet, but return. A quiet return. That night, as I passed by his room, I saw the door cracked open. Inside, he lay curled up, the old quilt pulled to his chin, his breathing slow and deep. I watched for a moment, then whispered to myself, "Welcome home, Noah." And for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel so hollow. It started with a question over cereal. "Mom, what does gravitational time dilation mean?" Noah asked, spoon halfway to his mouth, eyes lit with that same spark Mark used to get when he was deep into a theory. I blinked. You might want to slow down and start from the beginning." He laughed. "Sorry, there's this video I saw last night about how time moves differently near black holes. It said clocks run slower the closer you are to intense gravity." I sipped my coffee, watching him. This wasn't just curiosity, it was connection, a quiet reaching for something that once belonged to both of them. "You know," I said, setting down my mug, "Mark had this exact conversation with you when you were 7, in the backyard. You had sand all over your face, and he used an orange to explain black holes." Noah grinned. "Yeah. He said if the sun became a black hole, we wouldn't notice until 8 minutes later, because light has to travel." I smiled. "Exactly. I think you understood it better than I did." That afternoon, we cleared out the corner of the garage that used to be Mark's workspace. Boxes of old textbooks, a half-built model of the solar system, wires tangled around yellowing schematics. Noah held up a small chalkboard with Mark's scrawled equations. He really loved this stuff, didn't he? "He lived and breathed it," I said softly. Sometimes I thought physics was the only language he truly felt fluent in. Noah nodded. "Then maybe if I study it too, I can still feel close to him. Like he's still explaining things, just in pieces." The weight of that hit me. He wasn't just talking about science, he was trying to find a bridge between past and present, grief and hope. That night I found him in the kitchen sketching orbits on a napkin with a broken pencil. "Hey," I said gently, "I have an idea." We drove to the university library the next morning. I hadn't been there since the memorial. We sat in the quiet back corner where Mark used to grade papers. I pulled out one of Mark's old notebooks. He left notes for a course he never got to teach, astrophysics for beginners. Noah flipped through the pages reverently. Can I copy them?" I nodded. "They're yours now." For the first time in months, I saw a piece of Noah settle, like something inside him finally had an anchor. Physics wasn't just science anymore. It was a thread, a quiet, unbreakable thread between a boy and the man he lost. And watching him there, bent over formulas with focus and awe, I realized the universe might bend time and stretch space, but love always finds its way back. It had been raining for 3 days straight when my mother finally arrived. She stepped into the kitchen like she still owned the room. Same practical loafers, same scent of chamomile and starch. Only this time, there was a quiet hesitation in her eyes, as if she wasn't sure she still had the right to be here. "I brought banana bread," she offered, holding out a tin wrapped in a faded dish towel. I didn't take it. Instead, I motioned toward the kettle. "Tea?" She nodded, placing the tin on the counter and sitting at the edge of the stool like someone waiting to be called into a principal's office. Noah was upstairs with Sophie. They were building a blanket fort and arguing over which flashlight gave better ambience. Laughter occasionally drifted down the stairs, grounding the silence in the kitchen. "You look tired," my mother said, trying for gentle. "I am," I answered, "but I'm learning to rest in pieces." She gave a soft, knowing smile. That sounds like something Mark would have said. I stirred honey into the tea. I think I'm finally understanding the kind of stillness he carried, the one that lets you stay, even when everything hurts. She looked down at her hands. I was too harsh on him. I know that now. And I was worse with you. The words floated between us, heavier than steam from the kettle. You tried to make me in your image, I said, my voice steady but quiet. But I was never you. I never wanted to be. I know, she whispered. And I didn't know how to love what I didn't understand. We sat in silence for a moment, the tea between us growing lukewarm. Then the back door creaked open, and Sophie stepped in, hair wild, cheeks flushed. Oh, Grandma? My mother blinked, caught off guard. Hi, sweetheart. Sophie rushed over, wrapping her arms around her. We're having a physics fort upstairs. Want to see it? She chuckled. Physics fort, huh? Sounds official. Sophie nodded, then turned to me. Can she stay for dinner? I looked at my mother, her eyes damp but grateful. And for the first time in a long while, I saw her not as the woman who raised me imperfectly, but as someone still trying. I nodded. Yes. She can stay. Later, as we cleared dishes and Noah explained wormholes using spaghetti noodles, I caught my mother watching us, eyes soft, heart in her throat. There, around the kitchen table, 3 generations of women sat, 2 mothers, 1 daughter, bridging past and present through small acts of forgiveness. And though the past hadn't changed, something in me had. I no longer needed her to be the mother I wished for. I just needed her to be here. The living room was a mosaic of motion, papers taped to the wall, cardboard prototypes stacked on every surface, and Sophie at the center of it all, her hair in a messy braid and her voice full of spark. This, she declared proudly, pointing to a tangled sculpture of wires and LED lights, is a gravity-powered carousel. It's powered by falling marbles, see? Noah clapped enthusiastically. That's genius, seriously. You built this? With Grandma, Sophie beamed. We stayed up till midnight. I looked over at my mother, who was holding a mug of cocoa, a rare softness lining her face. She wouldn't let me quit, Sophie added. My mother chuckled. Persistence is genetic, I guess. The science fair was still a week away, but our home already felt like a workshop. The walls, once echoing grief, now vibrated with invention, curiosity, and second chances. Noah leaned in and kissed my temple. You okay? He asked gently. I nodded, overwhelmed. Yeah, I am. Because for the first time in a long time, we weren't pretending. We weren't tiptoeing around loss or forcing joy. It was just honest, unfiltered, beautiful in its disorder. Later that evening, we all sat around the dinner table. Noah passing mashed potatoes, Sophie talking over everyone, my mother quietly smiling between bites. It wasn't the picture-perfect postcard family. There were still scars, some too deep to ever fully fade, but there was also warmth. I used to think a family had to look a certain way, I said aloud, surprising even myself. But now, I think it just has to feel like home. My mother reached for my hand. She didn't say anything, but her grip was steady, reverent even. Sophie grinned. Well, then this is the best science experiment ever. Noah raised his glass. To gravity, forgiveness, and found families. We clinked glasses, and as laughter filled the room, I realized this was what Mark would have wanted. Not perfection, but presence. Not a monument to his memory, but a legacy that kept evolving, kept breathing. We were still rebuilding, still learning, still fumbling our way forward, but this time, we were doing it together. It was just past 9 p.m. The kids were asleep, the house finally still. I stood by the bookshelf, fingers grazing old spines until I reached the album, thick, worn, and humming with time. I carried it to the living room, the lamplight casting a golden glow on the cover. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. My heart knew what it would find. The first photo was of Mark and me on a rainy October afternoon, arms around each other, grinning like fools in soaked jeans. We had no umbrella that day, just the thrill of being young and in love, and an old Polaroid camera Mark insisted on carrying everywhere. I let out a soft laugh. You always made rain feel like summer. I turned the pages slowly. Mark dancing with Sophie in the kitchen. She couldn't have been more than 3, both of them barefoot and spinning to Sinatra. Another shot. Mark asleep on the couch, Sophie curled against his chest, a picture book open and forgotten on his stomach. My throat tightened. Noah came in quietly, carrying 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He sat beside me without a word, his shoulder pressing lightly into mine. After a moment, he asked, "Mind if I look?" I handed the album over. He flipped gently through the pages, occasionally pausing, a soft smile playing on his lips. "He had kind eyes," Noah murmured. "You can see it, even in photos." "He did," I said, and a terrible sense of humor. "He once convinced Sophie the moon followed our car because it liked her." Noah chuckled. "That sounds like a man who loved deeply." I nodded, eyes wet. He was. And losing him, for a long time, it made everything else feel muted. Noah set the album down and took my hand. "You don't have to mute him to move forward." His words settled into my chest, warm and weighty. I used to think that letting someone new in meant closing the door on Mark, but I don't believe that anymore, I whispered. He's still part of our story, just not the whole of it. Silence filled the room again, but not the kind that ached. It was soft, like a blanket, a quiet understanding. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Inside, the photo album stayed open on our laps. And for the first time in years, the past didn't feel like something I had to carry alone. The old sunroom, with its warped wooden floors and drafty windows, had always been my quiet retreat. Until now. Now it buzzed with the low hum of a drill, laughter echoing between walls that once held nothing but echoes. Noah was crouched near the baseboard, measuring angles for shelving, while Sophie sat cross-legged in the corner, sorting screws like puzzle pieces. "You're measuring that like it's NASA equipment," I teased, sipping my coffee from the doorway. He grinned without looking up. "Precision is the difference between a bookshelf and a domino." Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically. "Mom, do you really trust him to hang anything?" "I trust him to build it," I said, crossing the room, "and I trust you to double-check every step." It wasn't just a home project. It was something more, a symbol of this strange, beautiful second act we were stumbling into. We'd decided to turn the sunroom into a shared workspace, half for my sketches and clay molds, half for Noah's telescope and astronomy journals. A collision of past and present. A meeting ground. He stood, dusting off his hands, and looked around. "You ever think you'd be building something like this again?" I paused. "Honestly, no. I thought I'd be done building anything that mattered." He stepped closer. "But you're not." There was something about his voice, steady, low, certain, that softened the last edge in me. That part of me that still flinched at joy, unsure if I deserved it again. "You know," I said quietly, "Mark and I used to dream about renovating this room. We never got to it." Noah didn't flinch or look away. "Then let's finish it. For all of you." Sophie came over then, holding up 2 mismatched knobs. "Which one for the desk drawer? The silver swirl or the star-shaped one?" I smiled. "The star. Always." As the afternoon wore on, the room slowly transformed. Hammer by nail, word by word. There were pauses filled with stories, with jokes that made Sophie laugh too loud, and moments when I caught Noah looking at me like I was someplace he'd finally arrived at after years of wandering. When the shelves were up and the paint began to dry, I stepped back and looked at the space. It didn't just look new, it felt new, not because of what we built, but because of who we built it with. And in that quiet realization, I saw the truth. Healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's found in screws sorted by a teenage girl, a drawer knob shaped like a star, and the steady rhythm of 2 hands building again, this time, together. It was a Sunday afternoon, the kind where time moves slow and laughter echoes longer. The backyard was strung with paper lanterns, the grill hissed in rhythm, and a homemade banner fluttered across the patio. Celebrating firsts, not just birthdays. Noah was flipping veggie burgers with the precision of a scientist. Sophie was setting the table with mismatched plates she insisted looked quirky, and I stood at the edge of it all, quietly watching the pieces of my life come together. "Mom!" Sophie called, holding up her phone. "Group selfie before the burgers disappear?" I laughed. "You just want proof you cooked." She grinned. "Half-cooked. Noah did the heavy lifting." Noah looked up, smirking. "She stirred the coleslaw once." As we leaned into one another for the photo, Sophie's arm draped around my shoulder, Noah snapping the shot, I felt it. Not just the closeness, but the choice. This wasn't the family I had planned for, but it was the one that chose me back. After dinner, we sat around the fire pit. The kids roasted marshmallows while I quietly took in their chatter. At one point, Sophie nudged Noah. "Remember when you thought Mom hated you?" she teased. "I didn't think," he said, smiling at me. "I was sure." I shook my head. "I didn't hate you, Noah. I just didn't know how to let you in without losing the pieces I still had left of your father." He nodded, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other. No tension, no walls, just understanding. "Well," Sophie said, "looks like you both figured it out." "Not all of it," I admitted, "but enough." Later that night, after they'd gone inside and the lanterns had dimmed, I sat alone by the embers. I could still hear their laughter through the screen door, low, warm, alive. And I thought about everything it took to get here, the betrayals, the silence, the aching rebuild, the moments I almost gave up, the ones I actually did. But I also thought about the courage it took to open the door again, to let someone in, to let go of what was broken, not in bitterness, but in grace. Because maybe family isn't just about blood or names etched on a mailbox. Maybe it's about presence, about people who choose you when they don't have to, about showing up, not perfectly, but honestly. I used to think a family had to look a certain way. Now I know better. A real family is built in quiet forgiveness, in laughter over burned burgers, in second chances and late-night science projects. It's in a girl who used to slam her door but now leaves it open. It's in a boy who once stayed silent but now speaks without fear. And it's in a woman, me, who stopped measuring love by what was lost and started living it through what she dared to rebuild. So if you're still waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect apology, the perfect version of family, don't. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow right out of the imperfect. We didn't just survive, we became something new. And maybe so can you. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it with someone who needs hope, and drop a comment. What does family mean to you now?